of an institution of law and justice. So to a certain extent, I think that my talk will actually touch on all four of the pillars for the Catholic Foundation. It'll hit on marriage of vocation, how marriage can be the foundation of parish life, it's the domestic church, but also marriage as the key of social services, marriage being the key of social mobility, marriage being the key institution of social justice, and then also for education. We'll mention a little bit how marriage has an impact for child outcomes, particularly education outcomes. So that's just the preface that I'm not going to get into a debate about different theologies of marriage. I think there are various perspectives that religious people take on the question of what should the civil definition of marriage be. And I'm going to come at this from someone who works at a public policy think tank. And I'll open with something that will probably sound a little counterintuitive at first, is to say I would imagine that everyone in this room is in favor of marriage equality. We all want the law to treat all marriages in the same way. What we disagree about is probably what makes a marriage a marriage. And that the disagreement that citizens across the United States, including right here in Ohio, the discussion, the debate that's taking place is not a debate about equality, it's a debate about marriage. We all want to see the laws treat all marriages in the same way. The question is, what sort of consenting adult relationship is marital? There are lots of different consenting adult relationships. Consenting adult love can come in as many sizes and shapes as are imaginable. Which size and which shape deserves the label marriage? Because only if you can answer that question of what is marriage can you then draw conclusions about any given marriage policy and whether or not it's respecting marriage equality. So the first thing to say is that the opposition on this question, those in favor of redefining marriage, have done a great job of marketing. Marriage equality fits on a bumper sticker. It's an incredibly convenient slogan. If you use Facebook or Twitter during the debates before the Supreme Court, those in favor of redefining marriage could put up an equal sign as their icon. And it's a very powerful image. Who could be against equality? But it's a completely vacuous term. To say you're in favor of marriage equality tells you nothing about what it is that you think marriage is. And only that, the reason we titled our book, What is Marriage? The reason we titled the law review article that we wrote before the book, What is Marriage? Is that that's the question that the other side refuses to answer. And so it's interesting. You'll have someone say, I'm in favor of marriage equality. And you ask them, well, what do you think marriage is? And they stumble. They'll say it's something about committed adult love. But if it's about committed adult love, what reason in principle would say that that could only be between two people and no more than two people? Intense adult romance, caregiving relationships can just as easily be formed by three or more if that's all that marriage is. And so if you think that marriage is just about an emotional union between consenting adults, why would we have the legal principle of monogamy in American marriage law? Likewise, if you think it's just about mutual caregiving and emotional union, why would it be a union that is sexually exclusive? When we say that marriage is an exclusive union, we normally mean by that it's a sexually exclusive union. You only sleep with your spouse. But if marriage is primarily about adult romance and adult caregiving, why shouldn't spouses be free to seek out sexual fulfillment with other consenting adults? What is it about marriage that demands that type of exclusivity? And then lastly, if marriage is just about adult romance and about adult caregiving, why does it have to be permanent? Why couldn't it be a temporary relationship where you pledge to love each other and to take care of each other for the time being? Not for sicker or health, not for richer or poorer, not till death do you part. So in the article and in the book, we went through, we found some people who actually were willing to answer the question of what is marriage, so that it would include both the same-sex couple and the opposite-sex couple. And they had to redefine marriage to make it something about intense emotional commitment, about romantic commitment, about a commitment of caregiving. And the objections that we raised was that this simply collapses the marital relationship with companionship in general. It can't draw any of the contours that the civil law of marriage have drawn throughout American history, that it's a union of two people, that it's a union of permanency, and that it's a union that is supposed to be sexually exclusive. So that adultery is the way in which you violate the marital bond and the marital contract. And so we said, look, you guys can't even explain what gives marriage its distinctive features once you get rid of the male-female aspect. And then the second criticism we leveled is that you also can't explain why government's in the marriage business once you say this about marriage. If marriage is just about intense adult emotions and adult romance and adult caregiving, why do we have the state in the bedroom? If that's all marriage is, we could get government out of the marriage business. And so it just seemed clear to us that they were getting something wrong about the nature of marriage. And that what we had to do as philosophers and as public policy people was help re-articulate wisdom that was common sense to our parents and our grandparents. I should mention my co-authors. One was a classmate of mine at Princeton, and one was a professor of ours at Princeton. And for us, what motivated us at this, for me and my classmate, was that all of our classmates thought that we were on the wrong side of history and that we didn't know what we were. And it was, we kept interpreting this as, no, you guys don't know what you're talking about. And our professor was in the same boat. He's the one conservative professor at Princeton. One is enough. That's intellectual diversity. But it was a good experience for us because we had to think through, what was the implicit wisdom that our grandparents knew, but that now needed to be articulated. It was kind of like reinventing the wheel. You have to now give reasons for something that at one point was obvious. So one of the things we did was we read through some of the great philosophers and theologians on this to see what were they articulating about marriage, what were they saying about marriage. We looked at the anthropological record about marriage. And this is more or less how we've articulated it in the book. And I'll proceed for the next portion of the lecture in 3 basic steps. One will be what marriage is from a philosophical perspective. The next step will be why does marriage matter from a political perspective. And then the third step will be what will the consequences be if the law redefines marriage. So why should you care about what the law says marriage is? So let me start at the beginning. What is marriage? We follow Aristotle. Our position here is that Aristotle taught that we can analyze any type of community by looking at 3 factors of the community. The actions that the community engages in, the goods that the community seeks, and then the norms of commitment that govern the community's life. Normally when I give a talk like this, I'm at a university, so I always use that as the example because I think it can illustrate this fairly easily. So what is it that makes an academic community uniquely academic, rather than being an athletic community or a business community? What is it that makes Ohio State University an academic institution? And the first is that they engage in academic actions. And what do I mean by academic actions? The professors, they research and they write articles, they write books. The students, they read those articles, they read those books. The professors deliver lectures, the student attend lectures and take notes at lectures. The students will then write term papers, the professors will grade the term papers, students might attend office hours. Those are the sorts of activities, the sort of actions that make a university a university. That's academic action. And then you can say, well, what are all those actions oriented towards? What are the goods that a university seeks? And a true university seeks the good of truth. It's pursuing the good of knowledge. University is not about buttressing up pet theories. It's not about political correctness. It's not about justifying preconceived assumptions or conclusions. It's about doing away with ignorance, doing away with falsehood, and uncovering the truth of the matter. And that's the reason why when you were a student, your professors assigned all of those books you had to read. And hopefully they assigned books on different perspectives. So if you were discussing same-sex marriage, they would assign the book that I wrote, and they would assign a book that someone in favor of gay marriage wrote. So you could read the best arguments on both sides, so then you'd be in the best position to discover what the truth is. So that when your professor corrects your term paper, you're not upset. You don't interpret it as like an attack on you, but you interpret it as, oh wow, he just eliminated ignorance out of my life, and now I have a better grasp of the truth of the matter. That's the good, ideally, that universities should be pursuing. Not all of them live up to this, but that's what they're meant to be doing. And that can then explain the types of commitments, the norms that govern university life. Academic integrity, free speech, academic freedom, an honor code. Those are the sorts of commitments that universities live by, as a way of protecting the pursuit of the truth. If you don't let people who have unpopular viewpoints speak at your university, you're not likely to have the exchange of ideas that makes the pursuit of truth possible. If you cheat on your term papers, you're not likely to actually be wrestling with the arguments on both sides. If you don't cite all of your sources, if you cherry pick the data, those are all various ways in which you can cheat at the academic enterprise and fail to get to the truth. Okay, if that's how we can analyze a university, what makes marriage uniquely marital? What makes marriage unlike the university or unlike the investment firm or unlike the sports team? And we argue in the book that marriage is a comprehensive relationship, and it's comprehensive in exactly those three ways. It's comprehensive in the action that unites spouses. It's comprehensive in the good that the spouses seek. And it's comprehensive in the commitments that it requires of the spouses. So first, it's a comprehensive union in that it unites the spouses at all levels of their person, their hearts, their minds, and their bodies. So there's a comprehensive act that unites a husband and a wife. Second, it unites them with respect to a comprehensive good. It's not the good of winning the next football game or the good of passing the next test, but it's the good of creating and then raising new human beings, the most comprehensive form of goodness that we have access to in this life. And then it's comprehensive in the commitments that it demands of spouses, commitments of exclusivity and commitments of permanency. Let me say a few more words about this. This is the densest part of the talk. If you get through this part, the rest will be smooth sailing, but this is also the foundational part. This is the part that our grandparents took for granted. And now we have to think again about what makes marriage different. And so it's comprehensive. The first thing I said, it's a comprehensive act. In the tradition, it was called the marital act. And how does the marital act unite us comprehensively? The first thing to ask is you can say, what are we as human beings? We're not just ghosts who inhabit a body. We're not ghosts and machines. We're a dynamic unity of soul and body, of mind and matter. We're an embodied soul or an ensouled body, depending on how you think of it. And so to unite comprehensively with another person would require uniting with that person at all levels of our personhood, which would be a union of hearts, a union of minds, a union of souls, but also a union of bodies. Now, how is it that two bodies can unite? And so here we should think, what is it about any single body that makes it unified? What is it about my body that makes me a unitary being rather than being a clump of cells? Because you sometimes hear this in the abortion debate, that the unborn child is just a clump of cells. And we know that's not true, but what is it that makes the unborn child a unity? The unborn child's not a part of the mother, the unborn child's not a heap of tissue, not a clump of cells, but it's a distinct organism. Why? What is it about me that makes me a distinct organism? It's that all of my various parts, my heart, singular, my lungs, I hope I only have one, bones, muscles, cardiovascular system, respiration system, digestive system, all those various parts are coordinating with each other for the continued existence of myself. And with respect to all of those functions, digestion, locomotion, respiration, I can breathe on my own standing here. When I have dinner later tonight, I can do that on my own. When I can walk out of this room on my own. I'm a complete organism with all functions except for one. There's one function in which I'm radically incomplete. And that to perform this single function requires a mated pair. And so there's one function in human life that takes a male and a female to perform. And that when they perform it, they truly unite in the same way that my heart and my lungs and my stomach and my bones and my muscles are united to make me a single organism with respect to those functions. And so this is why we say that the marital act truly unites a man and a woman as husband and wife. They truly form that two in one flesh union. If you think the passage that we opened with from Matthew's gospel, and Jesus there is citing Genesis. And what he's talking about is something about the created order, how we're created male and female, and how that differentiation between male and female allows for this distinct act that can unite us in this comprehensive way. So that we don't just rub up or intertwine or interlock, but we truly form a unity to such a great extent that 9 months later, it requires a name. So the act that unites a man and a woman as husband and wife is the same act that makes them mother and father. The lovemaking act is also the life-giving act. And so that tells us something about the next step of the analysis. What is the good that a marital union seeks? The action is oriented, it's inherently structured towards that good of both the union of the spouses in this comprehensive bond, but also the pursuit of this comprehensive good. The same act that makes the man and the woman husband and wife also can make them mother and father. And this tells us something in the same way that professors who research and write books and deliver lectures and students who read books and take notes and attend lectures are all seeking the truth. In the same way here, it's that comprehensive union of the spouses that's also ordered towards the creation and then the bearing of new life. And that gives marriage its trajectory and its comprehensive good that's above and beyond any particular good. The particular good of finding out the truth about Shakespeare, or winning the next football game, or getting a good return on your investment. Creating and then raising new human life is one of the most comprehensive of goods, because conscientious parents want to raise their kids to appreciate goodness in all of its forms. So many of you look like you were probably parents, you still are parents, and you know that what demands of a parent is helping your children appreciate beauty and truth and goodness and knowledge and sports and music and art and all of the various things that make for a good human life. So then that can go to the last step of the analysis, the commitments. What sort of commitments do spouses live by? We say they're comprehensive commitments, a permanent commitment, and an exclusive commitment. And what sort of exclusivity does marriage call for? It doesn't call for intellectual exclusivity. None of you are cheating on your spouse by being here tonight at this lecture. That's not the exclusivity that marriage calls for. What marriage calls for is sexual exclusivity, because it's that sexual act, that marital act, that transforms an ordinary relationship of hearts and minds into the comprehensive domain of being a union of heart, minds, and bodies. And so it's that marital act which is exclusively reserved for the spouses, or at least it's supposed to be exclusively reserved for the spouses. And this account of what marriage is can explain why marriage requires that sort of exclusivity, because that's the action that unites a man and a woman comprehensively as husband and wife. It can then also explain why marriage has a pledge of permanency, because if you're going to unite comprehensively with your spouse, it has to be comprehensive throughout time. If you hold something back, if you say, well, I pledge to love you for the next 5 years, you're not really uniting in a comprehensive way. A comprehensive commitment is one that's unconditional. It's for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, till death do you part. That's the nature of a comprehensive commitment. And you don't make those sorts of commitments with your roommates, or with your teammates, or with your business partners. The type of commitment, a permanent commitment, is the type that you would make with a religious vocation or with a marital vocation. Again, because of the nature of the good at stake. It would be somewhat perverse if you pledged to live with your freshman year roommate till death did you part, because that's not the nature of roommate relationships, but that is the nature of marital relationships. And this account of what marriage is can explain it. All right, we're now done with the toughest part of the lecture, so we made it. This basic account of what marriage is, though, is something that it's true. I think this is reflected in the church's sacramental theology and moral theology, but I don't think it's unique to the church. I think you can find this basic sketch of marriage in the writings of Aristotle and Plato and Musonius Rufus, so it's in the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans. You see it in Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke and Immanuel Kant. You see it in Eastern thinkers like Gandhi. And what this suggests to us is that there are various political, theological, and philosophical communities who have all been grasping onto the good of marriage, trying to articulate what it is from within their own traditions. And whether it's a tradition of Roman law, or a tradition of Greek philosophy, a tradition of Enlightenment philosophy, a tradition of Eastern religion, they're all trying to identify what is this human good of marriage based upon human nature. It's not something that any of us created. It's something that was created when we were created. And I think that's why when Jesus says from the beginning, when he's asked about the bill of divorce that Moses gave, he returns back to the Genesis passage of the created order. It's something about human nature created male and female, and the possibilities that that creates for a comprehensive act, a comprehensive good, and these comprehensive norms. So then you could say, all right, maybe that's what marriage is. You've done this Aristotelian philosophical work to tell us about what marriage is. Why should we care? So that's the second step. Why does marriage matter? And here it's probably going to be most for the social services side here. Why does it matter? Because I'm going to say, why does it matter from a public policy standpoint? Why does it matter what the state of Ohio says marriage is? Why does it matter what the government, the law, says marriage is? And I think from a policy perspective, marriage exists to unite a man and a woman as husband and wife so that any children who result from that union have access to the love and the care and the attention and the devotion of a mother and a father. Understood this way, marriage is based on an anthropological truth that men and women are distinct and complementary. It's based on a biological fact that reproduction requires a man and a woman, and it's based on the social reality that children deserve a mother and a father. Whenever a baby is born, a mother will be close by. She's normally in the same room. That's a fact of biology. And I said it would get better. See, now there are jokes involved. It's hard to joke about Aristotle. So the mother is going to be in the same room. That's something that biology gets us. The question is, will a father be close by? And if so, how long will that father be close by? That's a question of culture. And it's also a question of policy and of politics. Because what we know is that when the father is not close by and when he doesn't stick around for the long haul, that's when social consequences run high. It's when social costs run high. And so marriage is an institution that all of those societies I was mentioning, societies across the globe and throughout history, devised to maximize the likelihood that that man commits to that woman, and then the two of them, united to each other permanently and exclusively, take responsibility to raise any children that they help create. And that explains why the government's in the marriage business. It's not because it cares about your love life or my love life, because government's a sucker for romance. The reason government's in the marriage business is because the sexual union of a man and a woman has an externality, to put it in economic terms, economic jargon. The externality is that child, which on average takes about 18 years of love and care and attention, 26 years if you're under Obamacare. But it used to be on average 18 years before it became a mature, self-sufficient adult, and someone has to provide that care and that attention and that nurturing. And the state's interest is to try to incentivize the man and the woman who create the child to commit to each other and then take responsibility for raising the child. And why does this matter? I'll say a couple of things about that. First is that there's no such thing as parenting. And some of you are probably parents. You haven't been parenting. You've either been mothering or you've been fathering. There's no such thing as parenting in the abstract. Parenting is a gendered phenomenon. Men and women interact with children in distinct and complementary ways. And the best way to illustrate this is to use a thought experiment. If I told you it's Saturday morning and a 5-year-old boy is in the living room wrestling with one of his parents, and this parent is teaching the 5-year-old boy to be masculine but not to be violent, that it's okay to put people in headlocks, but it's not okay to bite or to pull hair or to gouge out eyes. Which parent is most likely in the living room? And the laughter suggests that you get the point. On average and for the most part, that's something that fathers do with their 5-year-old boys. And it's not because of some gender stereotype in which we've conditioned fathers to wrestle on living room carpets and we've conditioned mothers not to wrestle on living room carpets. It's that that's what comes naturally to dads, and it's what dads enjoy doing with their sons. In the same way that it's frequently, on average and for the most part, the father who's tossing the kid up in the air while the mother is saying, honey, not so high. Because that's something that comes naturally to mothers. It's not that we've socially conditioned mothers to say not so high, but it's that mothers, on average and for the most part, tend to be the more nurturing, the more protective. Maybe it has something to do with carrying the child in the womb for 9 months, that they develop a greater attachment, they develop a greater concern for the child's health and safety. That tends to be how mothers interact with their 5-year-old boys. Again, social science is always a matter of averages, so that's not to say that you won't find a family where the mother wrestles on the living room floor and the father says, honey, not so high. But on average, given what human nature is, that's how mothers and fathers interact with their boys. So then when we look at the social science writ large, we find something striking. Boys who grow up without their fathers are more likely to commit crime and to end up in jail. And then the sociologists say there's a reason why. What takes place on the living room carpet when you're 5, or what takes place when you're 10 in the backyard tossing around a football with your father, or it takes place when you're 15 and your father's helping you get ready for your first semi-formal or for the prom or something like that, is that father is helping you develop into a mature man who can channel masculine aggression that could turn violent and destructive. That masculine aggression, if left unchecked, can be a destructive rather than a constructive force in life. And so boys who grow up without their fathers are more likely to commit crime, more likely to end up in jail, because it's the father who tends to be slightly larger than the mother, his voice tends to be slightly deeper, he tends to be slightly stronger, so he tends to be the disciplinarian. Now, fathers do something different but complementary for their daughters. It's the father who tends to be the one that scares away the bad boyfriend. He tends to be the one that polices what sort of guy is pursuing his daughter. And this isn't because mothers can't do this, but it's, again, he tends to be a little bit bigger, a little bit stronger, his voice tends to be a little bit deeper, so he's better at scaring away. But it's also, he tends to have been a young man himself. In fact, every father was once a young man himself, and so he knows what the wrong sort of young man might be looking for in his daughter, and so he's more sensitive to that concern. And so then when the social scientists look at all of the data, they find that girls who grow up without their fathers are more likely to get pregnant outside of marriage, more likely also to then have an abortion, because it's the father that tends to be the one that protects against premarital sex and early onset sexual activity. These social science facts are so well known that they've even entered into the political mainstream. So I'll read you a quote and then ask you who the author of the quote is. "We know the statistics that children who grow up without a father are 5 times more likely to live in poverty and commit crime, 9 times more likely to drop out of schools, and 20 times more likely to end up in prison. They are more likely to have behavioral problems or run away from home or become teenage parents themselves. And the foundations of our community are weaker because of it." Who's the speaker? President Obama. That's how mainstream these facts about marriage and parenthood are. And why is it that President Obama has been such an outspoken supporter of fatherhood? He grew up without a father. He's experienced firsthand what that was like. And so to a certain extent, like, he's evidence that this isn't somehow a death sentence. He's doing pretty well for himself. He's the president of the United States. So it's not to suggest that if you grow up in a single parent home that somehow you're destined for failure in life. But it is to suggest that it'll be a tougher climb. And President Obama will be the first to tell you that. This is one of the reasons why he wants to be such a good father for his 2 daughters. He wants them to experience what he didn't experience. And it's one of the reasons why he's in Juan Williams, and there have been various people within the Black community in particular who have been stressing the importance of fatherhood, because they know that's one of the things that helps with social mobility, that helps with anti-poverty. What we know is that at one point, 50 years ago, more or less every child was born inside of marriage and was raised to adulthood by their married mom and dad. Single parenting wasn't a phenomenon. Births to single mothers were in the single digits. Today, 40% of all Americans, 50% of Hispanics, and 70% of African Americans are born to single mothers. And the consequences for those children, in terms of the hill that they have to climb in life, through no fault of their own, are quite dramatic. If you look at the statistics, I just mentioned some by quoting President Obama, but we see that the correlates between poverty, increase of poverty, decrease of social mobility, increase in crime, decrease of subsequent graduation rates, to get to the education part, decrease in subsequent income and earnings, increase of government welfare spending, increase of police activity, increase in prison populations. Everything that you could care about, if you care about the poor and social justice, and you care about limited government and human freedom, is better served by a healthy marriage culture than by a government that tries to pick up the pieces of a broken marriage culture through a welfare state or a police state, which is more or less what the experience of the past 40 years has been. When marriage rates were high and when out-of-wedlock childbearing was in single digits, we didn't have the police force and the prison populations and the welfare programs. We currently spend more than $1 trillion every year on means-tested welfare. $1 trillion with a T. It's one of the largest budgetary problems we have because we're trying to pick up the pieces of broken homes. We're trying to be the father to the fatherless. So that's why it matters for policy. It doesn't just matter as an aspect of personal holiness or as a matter of sacramental theology. It matters for our public life and for our public policy. Okay, so then you could say, all right, you've given us an explanation of what marriage is. You've said a few words about why marriage matters. Why does it matter, though, if we redefine marriage? How does allowing Adam and Steve to get married hurt you or your marriage or hurt these kids that you're talking about, the 40%, the 50%, the 70%? What's the big deal with redefining marriage to include same-sex couples? I'll mention 3 things, and then we can get into greater detail during the Q&A, but I'll mention just 3 broad categories of consequences, and they're all under the general rubric of ideas have consequences, and bad ideas have bad consequences, because the law will function as a teacher, and the law will either teach the truth about what marriage is and why marriage matters and what marriage requires of spouses, or the law will teach a lie, and people will come to internalize that lie and then live out that lie. So let me say a few words. The first is that if you redefine marriage to exclude sexual complementarity, there will be no institution in public life that upholds, even as an ideal, that every child deserves a mother and a father. And in fact, to suggest that men and women are different, that mothers and fathers aren't interchangeable, and that children deserve both a mom and a dad, will be rendered hate speech. It'll be eliminated from public life. And if you doubt this, ask the former CEO of Mozilla Firefox. That's what the first consequence will be. It will be the public teaching of what marriage is and why it matters. We'll be saying, oh no, mothers and fathers interchangeable. It doesn't matter if it's a mom and a dad or 2 moms or 2 dads. All that matters is committed adult love. And so it redefines the institution away from the needs and the rights of children, and it recenters it on the desires of adults. It doesn't make marriage about ensuring the type of family that can unite a child with the man and the woman who created the child, which is one understanding of marriage. It makes it about adult romance, adult emotion, adult mutual care and support. And if you doubt that the law teaches, think about when we redefined marriage the first time with no-fault divorce. Prior to the introduction of no-fault divorce, when spouses were filing for divorce, they had to cite cause. And the causes for divorce in the common law tradition were the 3 A's of abuse, abandonment, and adultery. 3 serious reasons for going to court and filing for divorce. My spouse is abusing me, my spouse has abandoned me, my spouse has committed adultery on me. And the reason that adultery was grounds for divorce was, again, because of the nature of marriage and how the exclusivity that marriage required was that sexual exclusivity. So again, it's all tied together in a sound conception. With no-fault divorce, we said, no, you don't have to cite fault. You can get divorced for any reason or for no reason at all. That's the idea behind no-fault divorce. And what we saw was that divorce rates then more than doubled, because the law taught that marriage need not even aspire to being a permanent relationship. You can get out of a marriage for trivial reasons. And people responded to what the law was now teaching. Rather than saying, all right, we should try to work through our differences, we should try to reconcile, we can try to see if we can salvage this, we'll take the no-fault divorce exit from marriage. And so divorce rates peaked into the high 40s. They leveled off a little bit, but they're still much too high. And so the law will now teach something else. The law will teach marriage is primarily what the revisionists think it is, an intense emotional union between consenting adults, and the children will be all right. There's actually a movie by that title, The Kids Are All Right, about blended families. So this is the first line of consequence. It's a line of consequence that in some piece of writing I put to President Obama after that block quote when I read through all the statistics about the importance of fathers. The question for him is, before he evolved is when he gave that quote. And so now he's evolved. But President Obama, how would the law teach that fathers are essential when the law has redefined marriage to make fathers optional? That's the question, and that's the first broad consequence, is that it redefines what marriage is, and then it will shape our understanding of what marriage is, and then it will shape our behavior of what marriage is. Second consequence is that there's no reason why the redefinition of marriage would stop here. And in fact, we've seen activists create 3 new words to describe where they would like to see the redefinition go next. So let me introduce you to these 3 words. The first is the word throuple. A throuple is a 3-person couple. Take the word couple, chop off the C, and add a THR, throuple. And the argument here is that the revisionists are exactly right. Marriage is just about an intense emotional commitment between consenting adults. It's about adult romance, about adult caregiving and mutual support. And there's no reason why only 2 people can engage in that. 3 people can love each other. 3 people can take care of each other. 3 people can commingle assets. 3 people can co-own property. 3 people can be co-heirs. 3 people can visit each other in the hospital. There's no reason to be against it. So why, if you go to court and you demand marriage equality for the same-sex couple, would you then deny marriage equality to the same-sex throuple or to the opposite-sex quartet? Because the way that we got to monogamy is that it's one man and one woman who can unite in the act that can create new life, and every new life has one mother and one father. But once you say the male-female aspect of marriage is irrational and arbitrary and bigoted and just the result of prejudice and hatred and animosity, what's magical about the number 2? What's the principled basis for monogamy once you've gotten rid of husband and wife, mother and father, male and female? There isn't a principled basis. And so you, as quickly as night follows on day, you will see that the monogamy requirement of marriage will be challenged, and people will sue for marriage equality for the throuple. The next word that we came across was the term monogamish. Monogamish is a play on the word monogamous, and this was in the New York Times Sunday magazine. The previous word was in New York Magazine. This was in the New York Times. And it was a profile of the gay rights activist Dan Savage. And it was about 3 years ago. I think it was 2011. And he was, in the portion of the profile, it was, what can straight couples learn from gay couples? And he said they can learn the virtue of the monogamish relationship. And what's a monogamish relationship? It's a union of 2 people, so he wants to keep that, but it's a sexually open relationship. And what he says is that it's unrealistic to expect that you can have all of your sexual needs fulfilled by one person for the rest of your life. And so the emotional health of your relationship might actually be enhanced if you were free to seek sexual fulfillment outside of marriage. And he argued that provided there was no coercion and there was no deceit, so you weren't lying about it and you weren't coercing your partner, spouses should be free to have sexual relations with people other than their spouse. And that this was the virtue of the monogamish relationship. In the classical tradition, this is just redefining the vice of infidelity to be a virtue of monogamish. And that was his redefinition, challenging the requirement of sexual exclusivity. And then the last term was in the Washington Post. It was in an op-ed the month after the Supreme Court decided the Defense of Marriage Act case. And this is the term wed lease. And the idea here is that you can lease a car, you can lease a house. Why not lease a spouse? And this was a lawyer writing, and he was saying, we have an unrealistic expectation in that we think we can pledge to live and to love one person for the rest of life. So he's challenging the permanency expectation. And he was saying it would be much better. The reason that divorce has so much heartbreak and that it's so disruptive in people's lives is that they made an unrealistic commitment in the first place. They pledged to love till death do them part. But you can't do this. So we should be realistic about it. We should have 5 or 10-year marriage licenses that can then be renewed on good behavior. So if the marriage is going well, you can renew your wed lease. Just like if you like the car that you're leasing, you can renew your lease, but if it's not going well, you can always trade it in and trade up. And so the idea here is that if the marriage isn't going well and the 5-year wed lease expires, there won't be any heartbreak. There'll be no harm, no foul, because you only signed up for a 5-year wed lease in the first place. This is the one that I think is most unrealistic given human nature, but that's the argument. Now, whatever you think about the theology of thruples and monogamous relationships and wed leases, whatever you think about the theology or the morality of multi-partner unions and of sexually open unions and of temporary unions, think about the public policy consequences. Again, I had mentioned that the reason government's in the marriage business isn't because it cares about my love life just for the sake of romance. The reason government's in the marriage business is to try to get a man to commit to one woman permanently and exclusively so that any children that he helps create will be attached to him and to the child's mother, by attaching the man to the woman and then attaching the bonded pair to the child. Now think about the throuple, think about the monogamous relationship, and think about the wed lease. What they do is they maximize the exact opposite. They increase the odds that a man has multiple sexual partners in short-lived sexual relationships, which increase the likelihood that he creates children with multiple mothers to whom he's not committed and for whom he will not be available for those children. Directly undercuts the public policy purpose of marriage. But once you deny that the male-female aspect has anything to do with marriage, once you deny that procreation has anything to do with marriage, you're left with accepting these subsequent redefinitions. And they've already coined the words. In the same way that 10, 20 years ago, the phrase same-sex marriage was oxymoronic. If it's same-sex, it's not marriage. The same way that now we can kind of chuckle about wed lease and thruples and monogamous relationships. But for many Americans, they're already living out these realities. The monogamous relationship or the wed lease is just no-fault divorce. We just haven't been explicit about making it a temporary relationship at the get-go. But that's what many marriages are in actuality. The rates of hookups and of premarital sex and increasingly of extramarital sex for those who are married is just a monogamous relationship, but without the explicit label. And increasingly, I think we're going to see more people saying group marriage. If you are inclined towards that, who am I to judge? That's going to be the outcome. And it will directly undercut what we try to get marriage to do as a policy institution. I hear the bell ringing, so that means it's 7, so I'm going to try to wrap this up. The last consequence is one that should concern people in this room most particularly, and it's the one that we will experience first. I mentioned it last because I think it's actually, in the grand scheme of things about marriage, it's least important. I think the first two have to deal with how redefining marriage undercuts marriage. But the third consequence is one that we're already experiencing, and that's the consequence for religious liberty. We've already seen Catholic Charities adoption agencies in Massachusetts, in Illinois, and in Washington, D.C. have been forced out of the adoption industry. They said that they wanted to find orphans homes with married moms and dads. The government said that's discrimination. And so and in the case of Massachusetts, it was explicitly about licensing. It had nothing to do with funding. It's illegal to run an adoption agency without an adoption license. The state of Massachusetts said, we're not going to give you an adoption license unless you place children with same-sex couples on an equal footing as you do with married moms and dads. Catholic Charities said, we have social science that show that kids do best with a married mom and dad. We have social science that show that mothers and fathers aren't interchangeable. And we have the First Amendment, which protects our religious liberty to run our charity in accordance with our beliefs. And the government said no. And they refused to give them the adoption license. And so they chose instead to shut down and to get out of the adoption business. Then we've seen cases with photographers and florists and bakers and innkeepers and more or less every professional who intersects with the wedding industry have been sued for violating the human rights of same-sex couples who came to them seeking to have them provide their services at their same-sex wedding. The most well-known case is the case of Elaine Photography. Elaine Huguenin is an evangelical Christian in New Mexico who runs Elaine Photography. Back in 2006, a same-sex couple came and asked, will you be the wedding photographer for our commitment ceremony? She politely declined. She said, I only do marriages between a man and a woman. I'm an evangelical. That's what I believe marriage is. And I don't want to use my God-given talents to tell a lie about what I think God's intentions are for marriage. In 2008, the New Mexico Commission on Human Rights issued their ruling saying that Elaine had violated the human rights of the same-sex couple. This past summer, in 2013, the New Mexico State Supreme Court upheld that decision. And last month, when she appealed it to the U.S. Supreme Court, they declined to review it. So that means the state Supreme Court ruling stands. And what's interesting about this is that in the concurring opinion from one of the judges on the state Supreme Court, the judge said that the price of citizenship requires Elaine to take these photos. And when I was reading through, it was one of the last, I think it might have been even the last paragraph in his opinion, I stopped and I had to reread it because I was like, he must be saying the opposite. He must be saying that the price of citizenship is that the same-sex couple should just go to a different photographer. It's not as if Catholics and evangelicals have a monopoly on wedding photography and that there's no one else to take these photos. No, he was saying that she had to violate her beliefs in order to pay the price of citizenship. And it's not surprising that these religious liberty violations are happening. One of the main lines of arguments that we've heard from those in favor of redefining marriage is not that this is a debate on which people of goodwill are on both sides, and it's a tough question, and they're good people on both sides, and we should respect people on both sides. No, the way this debate has been framed is that if you are opposed to redefining marriage, you're the enemy of the human race. That was the phrase that Justice Scalia used in his dissenting opinion. And if you are opposed to same-sex marriage, we will kick you off of Duck Dynasty until we see that it might cost us ratings, in which case we'll put you right back on. Or we'll boycott your chicken store, in the case of Chick-fil-A. Or we'll force you to resign as the head of the technology company that you founded when you invented JavaScript. And so far they haven't reversed that because I think the tide is turning to be, it's more publicly acceptable to just vilify. What's interesting about Prop 8, it was passed in California. So this is the case of Brenda Knight, who donated $1,000 6 years ago and was forced out of Mozilla because of this. 7 million Californians voted for Prop 8. Should they all be forced out of their occupations as well? And some people are saying, yes, let's get the list and start going through. And so this is the consequence. It's been interesting to see that there has been some pushback. Honorable liberals have said, wait, guys, you're going too far. And we shouldn't be making this into a federal case. We shouldn't be making this into a capital case. We can have political disagreement and still have coexistence. But we've seen in a number of cases that's not what's happening. And unfortunately, sometimes the law is being used as a stick to bludgeon people who have traditional views about marriage and the family. And it'll be an open question for Catholic schools, for Catholic charities, for Catholic hospitals, for businesses that are just owned by faithful Catholics who want to be free to run their businesses in accordance with their beliefs. If you've been following the HHS mandate cases about Hobby Lobby and Conestoga Wood, one of the arguments that the Obama administration has used is that if you're in business in the corporate form, you do not have religious liberty rights. They've redefined, just like they redefined marriage, they've redefined religious liberty to be freedom to worship. It narrows, it constricts the free exercise of religion, which is what the First Amendment actually protects, into something much narrow of, on Sunday morning you can do whatever you want to do inside the four walls of your church, but once you step out into the public square, once you step out onto Main Street or onto Wall Street, you have to leave your religion at the doors. And that's not what the founders intended, and it's not what we should accept either. But increasingly, that's one of the conflicts here. And it's the one that's already playing out. We're already seeing this. So on that happy note, I'll stop and we can take questions and I'll try to give answers.
Thank you, Ryan. We have plenty of time for Q&A. Before I forget, I want to make sure that on your chair, if you'd like to receive invitations for conversations and other events of the Catholic Foundation, please fill this out. There's a basket outside the door there. You can put it in there, and we'll be happy to send you invitations. For the Q&A, Ryan, if you would repeat the question so everyone can hear it, and we have it on the recording, that would be great.
Yep.
We have a question right over here.
Yep.
I wonder, will be the policy now that we have polygamy programs on television where you see, I mean, it appears to be a very committed family or families.
Right.
Is that going to be declared no longer illegal, or they can claim all 5 families or however many spouses?
Yep, great question. So just to repeat the question so everyone can hear it and it'll be on the video is, what's next for polygamy, given that Hollywood seems to be normalizing it? And it's interesting that, that was one of the first steps in the push to redefine marriage to include same-sex couples, was that you got Hollywood showing, glamorizing same-sex couples and then normalizing it so that then the politics could follow. And so it's one of the insights here is to show how culture shapes politics just as much as politics shapes culture. So what the law does, the law is a teacher, I mentioned that in my talk, but also Hollywood and popular culture, movies and TV shows will then shape our beliefs that will then shape the policies that we vote for. It's interesting that when Utah was petitioning to become a state, one of the requirements of statehood that Congress enacted was that they criminalize polygamy, that marriage would be defined as a union of one man and one woman, and that those who were in plural marriages, those who were in polygamous marriages, that would actually be illegal in Utah. And most states at some point had a criminal prohibition on polygamy. There was a court case was decided either in December or January, where I believe it's the character from the Sister Wives television show was suing to have a religious liberty right to practice polygamy. And it went to, it's only been out of the district court, so I don't think the appeals has been heard yet, but they sided in favor of the plaintiff. So they struck down Utah's ban on polygamy. But that's not to say that the government is recognizing polygamous marriages. What they did was they struck down, if I'm remembering the case right, the criminal prohibition on being in multiple marriages, but they didn't say that government has to recognize multiple marriages. So the government right now is, if I understand it right, is only recognizing one, but you're free to live and to love multiple. It's a matter of time before someone will push to have marriage redefined to include multiple partners. There's a prominent statement. I was at New York University's law school last week, and I was debating a law professor there, and he signed a statement back in 2006 titled Beyond Marriage, and it called for a legal recognition of households with multiple conjugal partners. And they were saying that, marriage equality can't stop with the same-sex couple, but it has to go beyond that. So it's an open question. I mean, you can't predict the future. You don't know if the courts will be the ones that claim to discover a right to polygamy somewhere in the Constitution, or it will be the legislature who will say, we're going to redefine marriage to include polyamory, the throuple, or polygamy. And the difference here is that polyamory is group marriage. They're all married to each other. Polygamy is a series of conjugal marriages. So it's this man with that woman, the same man with a different woman, the same man with a third woman. Whereas polyamory, they're all married to each other. And I don't think there are any TV shows yet that highlight the polyamorous relationship, but there are several articles. And there's several things that I've written for the Heritage Foundation that just cite mainstream publications like New York Magazine, like Slate, like Salon. I even think the Washington Post has now run a profile of a polyamorous household. And so yes, that is going to be the next frontier. Yep.
I came across a video online of you and your co-authors.
Mm-hmm. And now they're all happening.
And then what happens is they all say, oh, no, that'll never happen. And then it does, and they say, what's so bad about that? Mm-hmm. Is that you guys?
Yes. So I'll repeat or do you have more? I'll repeat
I just said, where do we go from here if we've lost that argument among, like, the 20-somethings, they all say, what's so bad about that?
Yep. So the question was that there's, my co-authors and I have spoken together a couple of times, and some of these videos are on the internet. And one of the things that we had said was that those who would say, oh, you're making a slippery slope argument, it'll never go there. And then once it got there, they're like, well, what's the problem with that? What's the big deal? And one of the things that we also pointed out is in the book, we had all these predictions. We said that, if you get rid of the male-female thing, these things would happen. And by the time the book actually got published, those things were already happening. So they didn't even look like predictions any longer. They were just looking like descriptions of current events. So how to respond to that? I mean, I think there are a couple of ways. One is just to point to the actual consequences of that. When Dan Quayle criticized Murphy Brown, you remember like 20 years ago for intentional single motherhood, he was lambasted in the press, all the liberals attacked him. And then a couple years later, Atlantic Monthly, had a cover story titled Dan Quayle Was Right. And it's the sociologists who are actually looking at the data and they're like, wait, actually single motherhood's not good for the women and it's not good for the children. What we thought at the time when we were pushing for, it's the quotation, is it Gloria Steinem, a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle. When we were pushing all of this, we thought it would be good and true and beautiful. Now that the results have come in, we see that it's actually really, really bad. And so to a certain extent, it's not surprising that right now is the push to redefine marriage to get rid of the male-female part, because we've had 40 or 50 years where we got rid of the exclusivity part, we got rid of the permanency part, whether it was the hookup culture or pornography or adultery or divorce. I mean, each and every other aspect of marriage. In one of those videos, I say something like, heterosexuals bought into liberal ideology and they made a mess of marriage. And so it's not surprising that this next step is now being taken. So to a certain extent, speaking to a Catholic audience, you could say that the church has the ability to be countercultural, to live out the truth about marriage. No matter what the law says, we'll always have the ability to live out the truth in our own lives. And then there'll be a natural experiment. Look at what happens for men and women who commit permanently and exclusively and have kids inside of marriage and raise those kids inside of marriages and see the types of families, the types of outcomes. And then see what happens when you buy into the thruples and the monogamish and the wed leases. And when you say consenting adults should do whatever consenting adults want to do, whatever they do in the privacy of their bedroom is their business. And consenting adults of whatever size and shape should be free to do this. And I won't be surprised if it'll take longer, because I think the political ideology is much stronger in this issue. But there'll be cover stories that say Rick Santorum was right. If you think of Rick Santorum as the political leader who was the most brave on speaking on this issue. But that'll take a while, and there'll be a lot of destruction, a lot of heartbreak in the meantime. And so one of the things that an institution like the church can do is to be a field hospital, in the language of Pope Francis, and it can point out the more excellent way in the language of St. Paul. Because no one denies that this teaching about marriage is difficult. It's difficult for everyone. It's not as if it's uniquely difficult for those who are same-sex attracted. I think any human being living in America right now would have a hard time living out the truth about marriage as a permanent, sexually exclusive, monogamous relationship. And so the church can play a leading role in supporting people in that, if it is given the freedom to do so. And that's where that last consequence that I mentioned, the religious liberty consequence, is the one that I think we're going to be experiencing first. Is will we have the space to do the type of ministering that we want to do with respect to marriage? Yep.
In your I enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
In your presentation,
Can I repeat that part for the camera?
in your presentations, I know it depends on what group you're speaking to.
Mm-hmm.
Are you ever able to use the word sin?
So I normally am speaking from a policy perspective, so I don't. So I mean.
I think that's part of our problem.
Sure.
We can't say that it's a sin. We have to use their opinions as valid, and our opinions as not valid. And we can never mention that it's missing the mark is a sin.
Right.
Oh my God, no.
Yeah. So I mean, one of the reasons why I personally don't is that I think that can be a conversation stopper, especially on a college campus. And a lot of I was at Ohio State University's law school today. I was speaking there about religious liberty, but last week when I was at NYU, it was about marriage. I was at Stanford a couple weeks ago. And once you say something like that, people shut down and they don't listen and they're not willing to engage in argument. And so to a certain extent, I just said as a strategic matter, The law doesn't, and this is actually not just a street matter, this is the truth about policy. When the law defines marriage in this way, it's not saying that non-marital relationships are sinful. It's not saying that non-marital relationships are illegal. It's not saying that non-marital relationships are somehow banned or criminalized or anything like that. So the law teaches that this is what marriage is. This is the ideal. This is the ideal for adult sexual activity. It's the ideal for bringing up children. It's the ideal for family. But then it leaves adults free to do what they want to do. So defining marriage as a union of man and woman doesn't prohibit two people of the same sex or two people of opposite sexes from cohabitating. They can live and love how they want to. And so at the policy level, I'm just trying to get people to think of why does it matter? If people who are in the cloth want to speak about sin, I think I'll defer to Father.
Want me to break loose?
Yeah.
I have maybe a deep question, but
Sure.
I read recently that the California Supreme Court Advisory Committee on Code of Judicial Ethics has proposed to classify the Boy Scouts as practicing discrimination against gays, which would end the Boy Scouts exemption to anti-discrimination ethics rules. And any judge that has any affiliation with the Boy Scouts would therefore be concluded to be biased and unfit for the bench. And I'm just wondering if you're familiar with this and if it has any legs and if this is just the next thing coming down the line.
So I saw about this maybe at the end of last week, I think, or the middle of last week, and then this morning, actually, my boss at Heritage had sent me an email asking me to look into it, and I haven't had time yet. So that's actually one of my assignments for tomorrow once I'm back in the office. But something like this is going on. It's one way or the other, it's not a good sign. You know, whether it's just something that someone proposed and it has no legs, or if it actually goes somewhere.
Is there going to be a purge of people who believe like?
I think the answer to that question is to be seen. We've already seen that A&E tried to do it to Phil Robertson, and that Mozilla successfully did it for Brendan Eich. The CEO of Mozilla is no longer the CEO. But what I think was interesting about the Duck Dynasty example is that ordinary Americans were not where the Hollywood elites in the case of Duck Dynasty, or where the technology elites in the case of Firefox are. So if you remember what happened here, they suspend Phil Robertson, and then Cracker Barrel takes all of the Phil Robertson Duck Dynasty merchandise out of their stores. And it's within something like 48 hours that both companies reverse their decisions. And the reason why is that both companies, their business executives, were out of touch with their clients. The type of person who eats at Cracker Barrel and the type of person who watches Duck Dynasty does not share the values of the business elites who run those companies. And once the business execs saw, we're going to lose money on this, they reversed their decision. What that suggests to me is that there's actually a silent portion of America who shares the types of values that we share in this room, but who are afraid to say so out loud because they're afraid of being the next Brendan Eich. And so the question for us is, what can we do to help encourage these people and to give them courage to not silence themselves? Because the only way we can guarantee that we will lose is if we silence ourselves. And here I think the lesson is to look to the pro-life movement. 41 years ago, everyone was saying that the pro-life movement was over. 41 years ago, we get the Roe v. Wade decision. The Supreme Court strikes down pro-life laws in all 50 states. They manufacture a constitutional right to abortion on demand. And prominent politicians like Ted Kennedy and Al Gore and Bill Clinton and Jesse Jackson, who were all initially pro-life, they evolve on the life issue and they become pro-choice. Public opinion shifts to about 2/3 to 1/3, 67% pro-choice and only 33% pro-life. And then the elites, the media elites, the university elites are saying, look, all of the young people are pro-choice. 40 years from now, all of the pro-lifers are going to be in geriatric nursing homes, or they're going to be in the Vatican. And now, 40 years later, we see that's not the case. We see that my generation is more pro-life than my parents' generation. And we see that majority of Americans will now identify as pro-life when faced with the choice between the two labels of pro-choice or pro-life. And why is that? It's that 40 years ago, there were courageous people who refused to be bullied, who refused to be silenced, who refused to accept the Supreme Court as the last word about the truth about the sanctity of human life. And they did the hard work of, writing the biology articles, coming up with making the biological, embryological argument about when life begins, doing the philosophy, doing the legal analysis, doing the public policy and the coalition work. Groups like Feminists for Life, Americans United for Life, National Right to Life, the Susan B. Anthony List, Silent No More. You go through the line, the crisis pregnancy centers, all of this work. Now the question is, will people on the marriage issue be willing to do the same thing? Because whatever the court does, whatever happens in law, there are people like us who could be pushing back. And then the question is, you're asking me to predict the future. Will we? And I don't know. And that it's just a matter of what we choose to do. In the same way that 40 years ago, it was a matter of what those pro-lifers chose to do. And we shouldn't kid ourselves that it came with costs. In the late 70s and early 80s, to be a pro-lifer was not a particularly easy thing. It's easy today to be a pro-lifer. It is easy on a college campus or at a law firm to say you're pro-life in a way that in the late 70s and early 80s it was not. If you were on an elite college campus and you said you were a pro-lifer, that was the equivalent of being the enemy of the human race. But those people didn't give up. They kept pushing back. And now it's easy for me to be pro-life. And so I hope that 40, 50 years from now, it'll be easy for my kids and grandkids to be in favor of real marriage. Somewhere in the...
I was really going to ask something along the lines of what you just talked about.
Okay.
You were in Ohio, you're in Franklin, which is a swing state. Franklin County and Columbus, which are pretty contiguous, is the swing county. It's also one of the most homosexually established cities in the Western Hemisphere after San Francisco. What should we do? What can we do? It took 70 years of tragedy for solidarity to emerge, eventually, sort of be the one who said the king has no clothes, to see the end of the Soviet Union, the communist farce. Is that? I heard Robert George speak a couple weeks ago at Franciscan.
Yep.
One of probably 8 or 9 speakers. They were all very pessimistic. Can anything be done?
Yes.
Can you be more specific?
Yes. Yeah. So let me say a couple things. So I think the question of pessimism versus optimism. If Father Newhouse was still alive, he probably would have been at that conference. And I was fortunate. I got to work at First Things for 2 years, the last 2 years of his life. And Father Newhouse was famous for saying that optimism is a matter of optics. But what Christians are called to is the virtue of hope. And this Sunday, the church is going to canonize John Paul the Great, right? He'll be made a saint. And I think if there's any teaching from, the first thing he says when he walks out on the balcony at St. Peter's, be not afraid. So the overarching response is that we have to have hope and be not afraid to speak the truth. What does that look like concretely? I'll give you a couple of suggestions. I still do not think that the church itself has any effective means of communicating its vision of human sexuality to young people. That the sexual revolution and Hollywood has a near monopoly on shaping the moral imagination of young people when it comes to human sexuality. And so there is a challenge here, particularly for people who have artistic skills. If you were to watch the movie I would write, you wouldn't be happy. So it's good that I do philosophy. But there are people who do music and movie making and novel writing. And at one point, all of the greatest artists were believing Christians. If you think about the greatest musicians, Bach and Beethoven, if you think about the greatest painters, the greatest playwrights, Shakespeare, they were all informed by a Christian worldview. There's no reason why that can't happen again. And so one of the things is how will, if you're thinking of this diocese, this parish, communicate to its young people the theology of the body rather than the philosophy of glee. The philosophy of glee is that consenting young adults should do whatever consenting young adults, consenting teenagers should do whatever consenting teenagers want to do. How do we respond to that? Because glee is well produced, it's attractive, it's catchy, and most Sunday school programs aren't. So that's a challenge. How do we respond to that? I think the next is, what can we do as far as the pre-Cana programs? I mean, I would just say that the starting point is to solidify the base. We need to also do the outreach, but we have a captive audience week in and week out. And if you look at public opinion of Catholics on this question, it's roughly split like the general population. So how can we start doing a better job of explaining what it is we believe and why we believe it and transferring that to the next generation? And I think the starting point is not going to be the same-sex marriage question. It's the larger question of the sexual revolution, to which we are still struggling to articulate a response. George Weigel, in his biography of John Paul II, Witness to Hope, says that the theology of the body is a time bomb waiting to go off. And he wrote that book 14 years ago. I think it came out in 1990. That time, so that's 24 years ago. No, I think it came out in 2000. I forget now. 1990, so it's really been 24 years. That it's still ticking. And so there's a challenge here for people who have the catechesis skills, the teaching skills. How do we translate that into something that's accessible for a middle schooler, for a high schooler, for a college kid? If you're a chaplain of a college campus, how do we show that the random hookup culture is not humanly fulfilling? How do we show that what St. Paul is proposing is the more excellent way? And then there are questions of what can we do around the margins politically to shore up our ability to do this? And what sort of religious liberty protections can we pass now so that if Ohio redefines marriage, our church and our school and our business won't be harassed by the government? What can we do now to make sure that our pre-Cana programs and our various ministries won't be shut down as hate speech, these sorts of things? So that's where I would start. I was thinking, how can we improve the content of those programs? And then how can we protect the political right to actually implement those programs? Somewhere in the front. Who were you pointing to? Is it? Oh, sorry, I was looking that way. So yeah, we'll go here.
With your experience in the academy and the interaction you're having there, and the whole issue, say, of PC probably stronger on the academy as anywhere, don't they see the Orwellian nature of that? How do they justify, being the thought police, for Winston Smith, they're going through what he was experiencing. It's in some ways similar at a lower step, but moving upward towards that Orwellian idea.
So the question is about, do those on the left recognize the internal contradictions of, being the advocates of free speech, but also being the policers of speech and political correctness? And the answer is, it's interesting. It's a mixed bag. That there are some on the left who say error has no rights. So they're Latter-day Catholics. And they've come in to accept the syllabus of errors, except their list of errors are now anyone that has a non-left-leaning perspective. But then there are others that are more in the tradition of J.S. Mill and say that no, we should be protecting free speech even if we disagree with it. And so those are the types of people who normally protect my ability to speak at college campuses. They'll say, look, we disagree with him, but he wrote a book that was cited by the Supreme Court and we should hear him out. But then there are other people who are like, no, he wrote a book that's just full of hatred and we should not let him speak. And so another question, to answer the question in the back, is to say, what can we do to encourage the type of liberal who wants to at least respect civil liberties, like free speech and freedom of religion, and to discourage and to marginalize the type of liberal who wants to squash out opposition? Question right behind you. We'll go 1, 2, 3, because I saw there were 3 hands right in a row here.
I was just wondering about, I've heard that lesbian couples will have artificial insemination for homosexual pairing, and vice versa. So, would that be, have you heard of anything about?
Sure. Yep. So the question is about artificial insemination and same-sex marriage. And That's actually a fourth consequence that I sometimes mention, especially if I'm speaking at like a pro-life conference. I think there actually are profound implications for the nature of childbearing and rearing, because there's a human desire to want to have children of one's own, but a same-sex couple on their own is incapable of this. And so this is where you get, and in America we have an unregulated fertility industry, and so this is where you get the surrogate womb, the sperm donor, or the egg donor. And we now see in California that there's actually a conception mandate. So this is the reverse of, if you think there's a contraception mandate under Obamacare, in California they said any couple who after a year of experiencing infertility is eligible under every state-approved healthcare plan for fertility treatments. So the same-sex couple, after a year of trying, discovers they still can't get pregnant, would now be eligible under their state-approved healthcare plan for fertility treatments. And the reason that this should be disconcerting is that it's one thing to say there is a child that has no home that's going to be adopted by a gay or a lesbian couple, and that it's better to be adopted by loving parents than to not have any parents. It's another thing to say we're going to create a child from the get-go with the intention of denying that child a relationship with either a mother or a father. And the way that they do this, it's with selling eggs, renting out a womb, sperm donations. It's rife with all sorts of problems. The people who do the best job of discussing this are Jennifer Law at the Center for Bioethics in California, and then Alana Newman. And so if you want to look up their name, it's Alana Newman and Jennifer Law, L-A-H-L. And this, the surrogacy industry is really significantly driven by same-sex couples. And one of the reasons why this should be disconcerting to pro-lifers is that we know that the artificial reproductive technologies create and then destroy and freeze the ones that they don't destroy, a lot of embryos. That to get that one child that is born, they'll create a dozen embryos. They'll implant maybe 6. They'll freeze the other 6. They'll discard some of the embryos that are that don't score as well when they're grading the embryos. So it's another concern here is going to be with embryo destruction. Yeah.
When this debate, same-sex marriage, was beginning, civil unions was tossed out as a potential halfway mark. Are civil unions still being promoted, and kind of what's the distinction between?
Yeah. So the question is about civil unions, and more or less neither side is particularly interested in them. From the traditional side, it was that civil unions will just be a stepping stone to same-sex marriage, and that civil unions will kind of be like marriage light. If you opened it up to be kind of sex neutral, so that both same-sex and opposite-sex couples could get a civil union, this would just be kind of watering down marriage, and it'll be a stepping stone to same-sex marriage. And then those in favor of same-sex marriage said separate but equal is inherently unequal. And the state of California had civil unions for same-sex couples with exactly all of the same rights, benefits, privileges, and burdens of marriage. And that was the basis for the judge striking down their state marriage law, because he said separate but equal is inherently unequal. And so here you have the citizens of California tried to reach a compromise. They said, we're going to create a legal structure to protect those in same-sex relationships, but we think marriage is distinct and important, and so we want to keep a distinct label for it. And then the judge said, well, no, that just violates equality. Yep, this side.
Going exactly to that, a lot of people that are in favor of redefining marriage today, because you didn't really talk about this that much, they say they are continuing the civil rights movement. I mean, this is the next phase of literally, quite literally, there is complete continuity with what Martin Luther King was talking about in the civil rights movement. How do you go ahead? Could you talk a little bit as far as how you respond to that?
Yeah. So the question is about the legacy of the civil rights movement, and isn't same-sex marriage the next frontier? And you see this in President Obama's speeches. He'll say, you know, it's from Stonewall and Selma and what's my last S? He has a nice trio of S's. It's Stonewall, Selma, and I forget the last. But he has a series, and it's gay rights, women's rights, and civil rights for African Americans. Salem. No, is it?
Seneca Falls?
maybe, yes, for women's rights. So Seneca Falls, Selma with the bus boycott, and then the Stonewall riots. And his basic idea is that you can just, this is a continuous train of liberation. About a couple weeks ago, I published a lengthier paper for Heritage just replying to the interracial marriage example. Because one of the things that's true, just as a historical fact, is that not a single great thinker in human history ever said anything about skin color when discussing marriage. If you look at Plato and Aristotle and Cicero, Augustine and Aquinas, Luther and Calvin, John Locke, Immanuel Kant, Martin Luther King Jr., and Mahatma Gandhi, they never discussed race when they discussed marriage, but they all discuss sexual complementarity. Each and every one of these great thinkers discuss men and women, husbands and wives, mothers and fathers. The reason why none of them discussed race is because skin color is irrelevant to what marriage is. So if you think about the argument that I made about marriage, it's a comprehensive union where there's an act that can unite a man and a woman, there's a good they can produce, there are these norms that govern their lives, and race is irrelevant to the ability to form that type of union, to produce that type of good, and to live by these sorts of commitments. In the American context, we had a regime of race-based slavery. And the only way in which you could perpetuate that wicked regime is if you kept the races separate. And so you had to ban interracial marriage. Even after we abolished slavery, we still had Jim Crow laws, we still had rampant racism, and the only way you could prop up an illegitimate system of white supremacy is if you kept the races separate. So to a certain extent, I had mentioned earlier that no-fault divorce was when we redefined marriage for the first time. In actuality, the way we redefined marriage for the first time was with interracial marriage bans. When the colony of Maryland, which was the first colony ever Maryland is the first U.S. colony that had a prohibition on interracial marriage. It's also the first political jurisdiction in the world to ever ban interracial marriage. This is a Johnny-come-lately phenomenon, and it's all at the service of propping up racism and slavery. But the way that we undid this, if you look at even at the judicial record of the California Perez case and then the U.S. Supreme Court case of Loving v. Virginia, it's by looking at what marriage is. The court said, wait, race is irrelevant to what marriage is, so marriage law has to be colorblind. But marriage law can't be gender blind given the nature of what marriage is. Given the nature of it's a union of sexually complementary spouses that can unite moms and dads with their children. The other side knows this, but they continue saying that it's a civil rights issue and that if you oppose it, that you're the equivalent of those who oppose interracial marriage, because it's a very convenient talking point and it's a very convenient way to silence someone. In American public life, there's no charge that is worse than being called a racist. And so they know this, and that's why they use it. And so our response has to be to call them out on it. It's intellectually dishonest, it's despicable, there's no foundation in fact, there's no foundation in logic or history or anything like that. But that's not to say it's going to be easy, as you know from my Facebook page. Where do we want to go next? We'll go to the far right.
You mentioned several social statistics concerning why government was interested. What is the response of the other sides to those statistics?
So the question is about the social science. What most frequently will happen is they'll point to social science on same-sex parenting. And they'll say, look, we now have 10 years of data that show that two moms actually do a better job than a mom and a dad. And this is some of the social science that the court relied on and that the plaintiffs before the Supreme Court kept citing when they went to court. And what's interesting about this is that there have been exactly 3 studies conducted, all within the past 2 or 3 years, that actually met the standards of rigorous social science. That means they used a large, random, representative sample. And 2 of those 3, when they first came out, showed that children who were raised by parents in same-sex relationships had poorer outcomes. 1 of them didn't. But then in a follow-up, when some of the scholars actually investigated that, they said you're actually controlling for the negative outcomes. And that once you actually fix your sampling mechanism, all 3 are in the same line. But what they keep citing is, and there's a American Psychological Association brief that says, we now have 45 peer-reviewed studies that show that there are no differences. And that these studies used small, non-random, non-representative samples. And from a non-random, non-representative sample, you can conclude exactly nothing about a population as a whole. That's the importance of doing random representative sampling in order to get a meaningful study. But here's what we know from 40 years of rigorous social science on parenting. We know that biology matters, we know that gender matters, and we know that stability matters. We know that biology matters in that even when you have adoption at infancy, children tend to have a slightly steeper hill to climb. And so we know the biological connection of the mother and the father with that child matter. We know that biological mothers can hear and discern their baby's cry better than the cry of other kids. We know that girls who are raised by their biological fathers are delayed the onset of puberty by about a year. And so there's something about having your biological father in the house and the pheromones that he sends that delays your sexual maturation, which is different than if you have a non-biologically related male who is raising you. So there are various ways in which we know that biology matters. We then know that gender matters, that mothers and fathers aren't interchangeable, that moms and dads interact with their kids in distinct and complementary ways, and that this makes a difference. And then we know that stability matters, that for every transition a child goes through, there are poorer outcomes. And this is why cohabitation, divorce, and even divorce and remarriage have negative impacts. And it's interesting that divorce and remarriage seems to have no difference than just divorce. So it's not that second paycheck that matters, it's actually the stability of having the original family unit intact. So then it's not surprising that once we actually got some of the rigorous, large, random representative samples, that the results for same-sex parenting fell right in line. Because the first 40 years, they weren't looking at same-sex parenting. They were looking at single parenting, they were looking at cohabitation, they were looking at divorce, divorce and remarriage, and then the intact married mother-father home. And they saw that the first four had poorer outcomes in more or less every indicator compared with the intact married mom and dad family. They then said, all right, now we're going to have to start studying this other family type, the same-sex family type. And the initial studies that were, I think to a certain extent, ideologically motivated, came to the conclusion that lesbians are the best mothers of all. But here's what we know, and so it's not surprising that the more recent rigorous studies have come to the conclusions they have, because we know that no same-sex couple can have a biological relationship, both of them, with the child. At most, you'll have one. We know that no same-sex couple that's parenting will have gender complementarity with both a mother and a father, by definition. And we know that on average and for the most part, there won't be much stability because same-sex relationships tend to last much shorter than opposite-sex relationships. And that this has nothing to do with homosexuality, it just has to do with gender distribution. Lesbian relationships are actually the shortest lived of all relationships. And for many people, that's counterintuitive because you think that the lesbian relationship would last the longest because women are so good at relationships. It's actually the exact opposite. Lesbian relationships are the shortest lived because women have the highest demand for emotional satisfaction. Women initiate 2/3 to 3/4 of all divorces. And to use another homely example, when was the last time you heard a guy say, oh, I broke up with her, my emotional needs weren't being met? Right? That's the type of thing that your girlfriends will describe about why she broke up with her boyfriend. And so when you have the double female relationship, that's why it tends to be shorter lived. The double male relationship has a different tendency. It's the one that tends to be the most sexually open. And that's why it's not surprising that Dan Savage was saying, oh, the virtue of the monogamish relationship. Because it's not, again, it has nothing to do with homosexuality, it has to do with two men. Men tend to be the ones that are most sexually permissive. It's the women who domesticate the men in these relationships. And so the double male relationship tends to be the one that's the most sexually open. So again, neither the male-male or the female-female, at least preliminary social science would suggest is particularly stable. So the three factors that we know matter, biology, gender, and stability, are going to be absent from the same-sex parenting models, which is why these, two of the three, and then even all three, if you give credit to the critics of that study, come to the conclusion that the married, intact, biological mother-father home is still the best bet for children. But the response of the critics will be to cite some of these studies that use the small, convenient samples.
Brian, let's do just two more.
Okay.
One on each side. If you want to ask your question, we'll go over.
Okay, great.
You just answered it.
Oh, perfect. Yep.
At this time, it seems like same-sex marriage has the greatest traction in much of Europe. Why do you think that is happening now, and why do you think it's happening in these particular places?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so to put the question is, it looks like marriage is being redefined in Western Europe and North America, and that leaves out a lot of the globe. Why is it happening there, and why is it happening now? And so in response, I'll just say first is that the first time we ever saw marriage redefined in human history was the year 2000. So this is a 14-year-old proposition. And it was redefined in America, in the state of Massachusetts, by the Massachusetts State Supreme Court in 2003. So we've been experimenting with this for 11 years. It's a uniquely new phenomenon that I think we should all have humility about. What will the final outcome be? I think things are rapidly shifting. Why is it taking place where it is and now? I think right now the number is, it was 12 countries when the cases were going to the Supreme Court this time last year, and I think it's now a couple more, but it's under 20. And so there's something like 200 nations that are represented at the United Nations, and it's under 20 who have redefined marriage to include same-sex couples. So it's less than 10%. And even, it's not all of Europe that even has it. But I'm persuaded, a friend of mine was saying that, he thinks that same-sex marriage is a uniquely Christian heresy, in that it comes out of the Christian virtue of compassion, and it comes out of Christian senses of equality. That there's a tendency to do away with some of the metaphysical baggage of Christianity, the created male and female, or the mothers and fathers, the fact that the act that unites a man and a woman can also create new life. To get rid of that, but to want to be compassionate, non-judgmental, and to a certain extent, redefining marriage as a way of reaching out on this understanding to people with same-sex attractions. I think the response would be, and that's why it's also interesting to see that all of the nations that have, and I'm pretty sure this is accurate, so I'll refine that. Most all of the nations, just in case I don't have it exactly right, that have redefined marriage are formerly Christian countries. You don't see this happening in Islamic countries or in other places. And so it could be that it's a misguided application of the virtue of compassion. And I think the response here would be that you can't have authentic love or authentic compassion without truth. And that's what's happening, is that there's a crisis of truth in many of these countries. And that to fill that void is it's a misplaced application of compassion.
Last question.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
I just want to, from my experience, you can't argue with crazy without having a bloodbath. And I think after so many times being called a hater, and I said my response is that all you have? Mm-hmm. Where's the logical, factual discussion? And I find that it's very difficult to have discussions about same-sex marriage, about cohabitation, about all these things, because bottom line is it's emotionally filled.
Yep.
And even with just making of the laws, it's like it's geared towards adults. And we don't talk about, the comprehensive good, which is children. Mm-hmm. It's not from the children's perspective. What they need is what I want.
Yep.
And whenever you deal with something with what I want, you can't have a logical, truthful, honest, open discussion. So you can't argue with crazy.
Yeah, I mean, so to a certain extent, I mean, the question is, you can't argue with crazy, and lots of the problem right now is that the other side is making emotion-based arguments, not reason-based or logic-based. And I think here that this is also similar to the pro-life movement, to the pro-life movement and what they experienced from the pro-choice movement. They were denying the humanity of the unborn child. It's just a clump of cells. That's not a science-based argument. They were claiming that we were waging a war on science when we have the scientific facts on our side. And you can't argue with crazy and maybe convince that person, but you can convince the other people who are listening. And I think over time, the view that the unborn child is a clump of cells is just not persuasive to anyone any longer. And maybe we haven't persuaded the crazies who were making that argument at the time, but I think even them in their heart of hearts knew that it wasn't true. It's interesting that I think this is also in Weigel's biography of John Paul II. He says, it would be interesting to see some of the Enlightenment philosophers, what they would do today when they see it's the Catholic Church, which is the great defender of human reason in Western life. If you think about the encyclical Fides et Ratio, John Paul II is defending the ability of reason to know truth, and to know truth, both metaphysical truth and to know moral truth, and that it's only truth that sets us free. And so if you read, I think the Evangelium Vitae, Veritatis Splendor, and Fides et Ratio, you have a trilogy of encyclicals where he's saying you can't even have authentic democracy once you cut it off from its basis on truth. And and so this is, someone else had mentioned solidarity. I mean, here you have, it's the Pope, the President, and the Prime Minister, right? The threesome who bring down communism, and it's partly by the moral authority that John Paul II could bring to the truth claims about the human person, and that he saw the 20th century as a crisis of truth. And whether it was the two world wars, whether it was the concentration camps, the killing fields, the gulag, that all of those things were built on lies, and that he saw it his job witnessing to hope, but also witnessing to truth, because in the same way that the only authentic love will be one that's built on truth, the only authentic hope is one that's built on truth. So I think you're right. It's incredibly frustrating when I go places and I'm trying to argue with crazy, but yeah, but it's yes, which ultimately will set us free. And I think it's if there's a common Christian vocation, it's bearing witness to the truth. That's something that all of us have an obligation to do. And then it just becomes a question of how can we do it most effectively, given the audience that we're speaking to, and given some of the emotional baggage and the emotional starting points that they're coming with. Can we? There was one more hand in the back. But, yeah.
Just one more.
Yep.
I apologize.
That's okay.
Waiting till the end because I thought probably this would sort of be talked about. But thank you for your presentation and everything. You had a really good rationale for everything. I guess that does leave the one question of marriage aside, same-sex gay couples, lesbian couples that are monogamous. Good people in every sense of the Catholic word, again, aside from marriage, if they aspire to be good Catholics and people of God, what are they to believe?
Sure.
Is the Catholic teaching truly that they are not so much sinners, but they are called to abstain? And logically speaking,
Yeah.
I'm
Yep.
trying to
Sure.
reconcile that
Yeah.
in your head, and when when you know a lot of people that maybe they're gay or lesbian and fit this description.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I think it's a great question to end with, because I think what the church teaches and what I think sound sexual teaching would require is chastity on the part of everyone. And what that requires is outside of marriage, no sexual activity, and that's true whether you're attracted to people of the opposite sex or people of the same sex. And that this isn't to somehow, I think, criticize the character of people who experience same-sex attractions. And well, I think, so this actually goes to the question of the gentleman sitting next to you, is that one of the things that I think is just starting within the Christian community, and it's never happened before in 2,000 years of Christianity, are people who experience same-sex attractions who are aspiring to chastity talking about it. There are now several books that you can read who are written by Christians who say, look, I'm attracted to people of the same sex, but I don't think it would be good for me to act out sexually on those desires. There are entire blogs now devoted to people who have same-sex attractions, who are trying to live out the church's teaching, both evangelicals and Catholics. Some of the interesting ones have both evangelicals and Catholics writing about their experiences together. And this is the first time it's happening in human history. And that to a certain extent, I think it's a shame that in the same way that there were some feminists who claimed to speak for all women, and who said that if you're a woman, you have to be in favor of abortion. And we know that's not true, that Feminists for Life do a great job speaking on the behalf of women who are in favor of life. This was a group of people saying, wait, the gay rights movement doesn't speak for me. I'm a gay Christian who thinks that acting on those attractions would actually be bad for me, and I experience the gospel as liberating, and I want to find a pastoral strategy to help communicate this to other people who are in my situation. And this is something that's just starting. It's like 10 years old, if that. And so again, when I was answering one other question of saying that, we've been living for 11 years in this country with a state that has redefined marriage, it's a similar time horizon for people who are open about their sexual attractions, but who want to live out the virtue of chastity. And to a certain extent, we need to allow the Spirit room to do his work here, and listen to what they're telling us, and provide them with a platform and with the support that they need. And that's something that I think it'll be interesting, how pastors, because it's something that, a parish 50 years ago didn't have, and now there might be a group explicitly oriented towards ministering to people with same-sex attraction. I think the group Courage, do you know how old? I mean, that's probably about 20 years old, but it's really starting to make it in the mainstream. That was originally a much fringe group. I mean, it's Orthodox, but it was just not as widely known. It's interesting that Justice Scalia's son is a priest for the Diocese of Arlington, and I don't know if he still is, but he was the chaplain of the Courage chapter in Arlington. And so I think that can make a difference. If your conception is that if I want to love my gay and lesbian friends, I have to support them in acting out on those sexual desires, that'll lead you to one set of conclusions, but it can also be, I've now encountered and experienced gays and lesbians who are telling me something else, and I want to elevate those people to a similar level of prominence as Dan Savage and Andrew Sullivan.
Thank you
Great.
again, Ryan.
Thank you.
Please stand for a blessings from my blue jacket friend, Father Rocco.